From Yahoo Finance, this is Electionomics. I'm Rick Newman.
And I'm Alexis Christoforous. Welcome to another edition of Electionomics, where we are broadcasting once again from our respective homes. Thanks so much for being with us. Joining Rick Newman and myself today is Stanley Greenberg. He's a Democratic pollster who's worked with Bill Clinton and Nelson Mandela, a who's who list. He's also the author of RIP GOP. And today we're going to talk about this pandemic and its ongoing effects on the 2020 election as we inch closer to November. Stan, it's so good to have you with us. Let me begin by asking you about Joe Biden. I mean, we sort of forget we have an election going on, the backdrop to this pandemic. We haven't heard a lot about Biden. According to your latest polls, how is he doing?
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for including in this new format. I may like it better than the actually getting together and seeing you in the studio. But we talked before, but this has really become an extraordinary election, become even more extraordinary, given the pandemic. I can't believe the chapters that we now have to play through, have already played through, before we even get to a November election. We have a primary that Biden, triumphed, had momentum, but it all got, delayed, by the pandemic, the postponing of the actual votes. Sanders hasn't endorsed, and so we have a very inconclusive primary. You have Biden being pushed out of the spotlight, by the president being on every day, dealing with the crisis, and very much of it shifting to, to how Trump is handling the crisis, and that too has changed. And people are very obviously focused on their own lives and their own families. So he's out of the spotlight. The structure of the election, amazingly, has not changed. I trust voters to kind of make some very big judgments about the state of the country. I believe voters were in revolt against President Trump, and they were acting on it at every chance they had. I think that'll be put on pause, but every poll I'm looking at, shows the election totally stable. The vote, that we did in a poll, that, finished on Monday, was stable. The vote for Congress was stable. They were actually a little better for the Democrats, but basically, stable. And so I think voters will just pause on that. And then when they get past the crisis, and if we get to a point in May when we're getting back, I think they will re-engage. And I think the structure of the race will continue. But it's obviously it'll matter how the president handles it. And the president has the spotlight, and that will be the most important piece for him.
Stan, I get your research, and I have been interested in your findings in the battleground states. On this podcast, we do focus a lot on the swing states or the battleground states, and even on a relatively small number of voters, swing voters in the swing states who we think are going to determine the outcome of the election. So your recent polling seems to have shown that Biden is pretty strong in the swing states, right?
Yes. Bernie is not. Sanders, if you look at Sanders, in those swing states, he only matches Hillary Clinton's performance in 2016. But Biden was running about 5 points stronger than Trump in those states. That's a 6-point swing. In those states, that would translate into a pretty good electoral college victory. And his actually biggest problem was consolidating Democrats. Democrats, Sanders voters are very much somewhere around 3/4 of them are voting for him in a general election, but Democrats are not consolidated. They are still fractured, and that's still one of the big factors in how, in my view, how big Biden wins.
So if your polls are showing Biden with, let's say, something like a 5 percentage point lead, does a lead in if the election were tomorrow, would that strongly suggest that Biden would win by 5 percentage points?
No, that's what we're looking at there is the battleground states. Donald Trump won these 16 battleground states by.
Can you just name some of them so everybody knows?
Sure. Yes. So you're dealing obviously with Maine. You're dealing with New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa. You go to North Carolina, Virginia, North Carolina, Florida. Go over to the west. You go to Colorado, Nevada, Arizona. I may have missed a state, but it does not include Texas. And it doesn't include obviously, the big states of New York and California that are, not, competitive, and Texas, which actually might be competitive, but we didn't include it. But if you look at those states, Hillary Clinton, lost them by 1. She won the national vote by 2. So these states are a little bit more, Republican. And so if you look at the swing in this vote, Trump, won it, by 1. He's winning, Biden's winning it by 4 or 5 if you squeeze to a 2-party election. That represents a 5-point swing. So that meant, like, if Hillary won by 2 nationally, that would translate into 7, nationally. So it's not like the 9 points that Democrats have been winning in the midterm elections. It's not quite there because, to be honest, Democrats are still pretty divided. There are a lot of Sanders voters who are not yet consolidated. The biggest problem aren't swing voters. The Republican Party has been shedding voters. They've been driving voters away. I've been trying to tell this story, but people are so focused on the rallies, the campaign rallies. They think, well, look, these voters still are for Trump. Well, those are the campaign rallies. They're not the real voters. If you look at white working class voters in the midterm elections, he lost them. The swing was 13 or 14 points where he lost his margin amongst those key voters. And the women have continued to move against him. So it's actually become a fairly close race with the women. And they are a majority of the white working class. And so there's been a revolt against Trump that people just haven't paid attention to. There are less Republicans, by about 3 points in terms of people identifying as Republican. And they're becoming independents. And so the independents are heavily voting Democratic. But the other piece is, and I didn't believe this was happening. This is the biggest surprise for me in the election. I thought these voters, the moderate Republicans and the McCain Republicans, who have pulled away from the Republican Party because this is a Tea Party Trump, party. They've pulled away. I thought maybe by November that they would, vote for Biden or depending on the candidate the Democrats ran. But they're voting in the Democratic primaries. So if you look at Michigan, at the most Republican towns, there's been this 45% increase in turnout in Republican towns, Republican townships in Michigan terms, voting in the Democratic primary. And so this revolt against, Trump has carried through from the moment he came into office.
Does that mean
every election they play it out, and the margins get bigger. It's paused, and we'll have to wait to see. Look, if Trump really impressed people, really took control of the government, reached out to work out with Democrats and Republicans, in some ways apologized for the things that he didn't get right, tried to unite the country, behind kind of a new deal to bring the country out of this. But none of that's happening. He's acting like the same Donald Trump. There just isn't any evidence that he's winning over, swing voters. And his approval rating in most of the public polls now is kind of fallen back to where it was before the crisis.
So Stan, just to clarify,
for a second, Stan, because I think it was always going to be a referendum on Trump. I think we knew that from the get-go. But, in many ways, this pandemic could either help his chances or hurt his chances. What are you seeing in the polls right now with the way America is responding to his response to this pandemic? And is there enough time there to change the tide between now and when we do go to the polls in the general election?
Right. Look, I agreed with you that this was about Trump. I mean, this was people. That's what's motivating people. That's what's pushing people away from the Republican Party. And I thought Trump was in a lot of trouble all along the way, even on the economic issues, because at an personal level, people were still struggling and actually didn't believe this exaggerated view that things have never been better for them and their family. But the pandemic, I think, has changed that, but it doesn't necessarily help them, because now it's a question of, well, who can handle this kind of crisis? The comparison then becomes important. But I agree with you. It's now moved just about Trump to, I think, now a comparison of how is Trump doing versus the person who would replace him.
Stan, let me ask about Joe Biden's vulnerabilities here. Now, he still has to deal with Bernie Sanders to some extent, so he is not, getting all the advantages of being the Democratic nominee yet. Presumably he will if something unforeseen does not happen. but he doesn't. The raps against Biden. He doesn't excite people. He doesn't have a strong appeal to young voters. Turnout might be lower than it would be with a rabble rouser like Bernie Sanders. What about those vulnerabilities?
Well, look, sometimes a candidate is right for the time, and you just don't get it. I worked for Ehud Barak, when he was running, in Israel. He was a military person. He was awful on TV, and he would just say what he thought. At one point, he was asked, if if you were born in the Palestinian territories, how would your attitude be different? And he said, well, I might have been a terrorist had I grown up in the Palestinian territories. And like for 6 months, in the polling, he wasn't even considered a legitimate, candidate. But you reach a point in time, and you know what, being that kind of blunt military person is right for the time, given Israel, given a particular point in time when you want a certain kind of leader. And so Biden, with his experience and given everything that's happened here and this mess in handling the pandemic, it just may be right for the time. And we'll see how he picks a vice president. He said it'll be a woman. Will that unite the party? Will that create excitement? I think the challenge is, do you actually have a convention? Do you have those things that enable you to help unite and motivate? I think the voters are self-motivating. We've had historic turnout, and we had historic turnout for Biden. If you look at what happened ultimately in the suburban areas and other areas, and also working class areas, they had big turnouts in the primary, historically high turnouts. In order to to make the kind of change the country wants, I think they will get excited and united ultimately around Biden. But you have to go through a process of finishing the primaries, and it's hard because it's been extended. But I wouldn't assume that once you get to that moment, why wouldn't he be able to unite the party, which has Trump as as a motivator? Having a real convention, I think, will be very important for him. But it's uncertain. I think Trump will push very hard for him to have a real convention, because it would be a real judgment about his presidency if he couldn't have the convention. So they will have the convention. So I think there'll be a lot of pressure on Democrats to hold their convention as well. And I think Biden needs it as well.
Stan, what about, because I saw in some of your research and your polling that the Democrats could actually take back the Senate. Do you see that being a scenario where they get control of Congress, but Biden doesn't win, that Trump is president, but Congress swings Democratic?
No, I know. Look, there's such straight ticket voting, going on right now. There's no way you're going to have a reversal, switching that result when you get to the Senate. So I think there'll be a pressure towards straight ticket voting. I think whoever wins the presidency, I don't think the House is going to switch. The suburban swing is so strong, and it got stronger. If you look at what happened in the midterms, if you look at what happened in 2019 in those elections in Virginia, Democrats made even more suburban gains. So every trend has continued right through his presidency. So I don't see any kind of reversal in the House, because that's where they made their biggest gains. And the presidency will depend, that will determine the Senate. I think the Democrats have a 50-50 chance on the Senate. But that's only if they're winning the presidency.
Can you describe where will the battle for the Senate turn?
Well, I mean, if you look at these results, I think in Maine and Colorado, you have the Republicans in the biggest trouble, and then you obviously need to get, I think it's Arizona and North Carolina are going to be the big ones that would flip it. If you look at Arizona, the Democrats are looking pretty good in that race. It's a pretty independent candidate, who's doing well. But North Carolina, it's pretty unpopular incumbent. So, I mean, I think that's the front line, North Carolina, Colorado, for this.
So, Stan, I want to ask you about the economy and how that is likely to factor in. So, we've seen some research recently that suggests the economy is a little less important to voters than it has been in the past. It's not necessarily the economy stupid anymore, but that was before the coronavirus recession. So, on election day, we could have, I mean, the unemployment rate in swing states could be several, and probably will be several points higher than it is now. Would that inherently work against the incumbent Trump? That would be the conventional wisdom, right?
I think so. But I mean, it's not just conventional wisdom. If you look at the academic literature, it is change in median income in the 2 quarters prior to the election is the translation of the economy. There isn't actually a very strong correlation between full employment and employment level and vote for president. It's changes in the economy, whether income is going up or down. And I think it's more likely they're going to be struggling with declining income, declining median income, and faltering employment. And so I think that's going to make it a lot harder for the president. I mean, I think he already had it very difficult because he's running on a whole range of issues in which he is out of step with the country. This is become a pro-immigration country, a pro-trade country. I mean, on almost every issue that the president identifies, the country has become much more conscious of what it believes as a country. Immigration is like the most important, for example. I mean, the president wants to close borders, blame China, wants to build the wall. In the middle of his press conferences, even in the last few days, he will talk about the wall is one of his accomplishments and one of the things that are important to him, and as well as talking about having stopped movement, from Mexico. Well, the polling that we finished this week shows that people have an incredibly negative view of the border wall. People believe immigration benefits the country, and they've come to believe this in very large numbers in reaction against Trump. And so he's still running as an anti-immigrant president who wants to close the border, limit trade. On oil, he's talking about tariffs. He's talking about a whole range of things that are actually the country's against. As he's become pro-tariffs, the country's become very pro-free trade in reaction against everything he's doing on the trade war and dealing with China. So, once it moves off the economy, what kind of country we are, whether we're a diverse, country and accept the fact that our immigrant history, whether we're open to the world or not, or engaging with the world or not, or leading the world or not, he is out of step with the country. And it's why the coalitions have formed against him. It's why he's lost so many Republicans. He's getting it back to the economy, but in a way that disadvantages him. It potentially advantaged him, but people, are on the edge, still struggling with the cost of, before the crisis. We're still struggling with the cost of housing and childcare and almost everything else. And they were not, standing up and applauding when he would give these speeches about America being at the greatest point ever. But now he has an economy that will hurt him, based on the history of how the economy affects voting.
But Stan, could possibly people look at it this way? Hey, we had a pretty strong economy before this pandemic. We had a nice stock market rally and a strong economy in the years that he was in office. Perhaps a change in administration would be too disruptive to the economy and to the country at such a fragile moment in our history. Might there be people thinking that way, and could that not advantage Trump?
Well, look, it's not the way it's worked. If we look at the academic literature, that is, people have a pretty short time horizon. To the extent to which they vote the economy, it's over a short time horizon. They don't vote they don't vote the history. Look how much trouble the Bill Clinton had getting a strong economy translate. Took into his reelection. So 4 years before he really, got credit for that, to a very strong economy, and then further into his presidency. But it's hard. People have am I making gains now? and my now is the last 6 months. You know, they do not have a longer time frame on it. If we're looking about, they have a lot of things that affect their vote, but if you're looking about the economy, it is the short-term impact on their median income.
So Stan, what you're saying, I think, will be heartening to Democrats who look at what's going on. I mean, there's some Democrats who cannot believe Trump even still has a 42 or 45% approval rating overall,
Right.
and he's close to 50% in terms of his handling of the coronavirus crisis, even though that may have come down a little bit recently.
Yeah.
How do you explain that Trump at least has that much popularity? And just also for our audience to understand, since you have worked for Democrats, how do people know that this is not just wishful thinking?
Well, first of all, I'm focused on elections. Okay, I'm looking at polling, obviously very closely. I'm a pollster. But I'm looking at actual elections and what's happened in election after election, and not fluky elections because one party was excited and had high turnout and the other low turnout. What you've looked at is historic turnout in the elections 1 year after he came in. If you look at what happened in Virginia initially in 2017, you had the midterm elections, which had the highest midterm election in the history of the country, and the Democrats won by 8.6%. And then you looked at the end of 2019. We had the elections in Virginia again, or all the suburban trends, continued. You looked at him campaigning in Kentucky and Louisiana, and Democrats winning the governor's races, in those states, with him campaigning, with historically high turnout. And in every case, the suburban trend continued. And so what I'm looking at in the polls is, yes, but I would pause, obviously, and separate my thinking if voters weren't acting on what they're saying. And also, it's also not just what they're saying about voting, it's what their attitudes are. Look at views of immigration. He's made immigration his top issue. He ran on it. That's who he announced his candidacy on dealing with Mexican immigration. If you look at the policies in office, every day it's been an escalation. What he did on the border, separation of kids at the border wall. He still talks about it, now as as the evidence of his progress in achieving. He is running against immigration as his presidency. So at the same time that is happening, the country has gone from about having half, we think, immigration benefits the country to about 2/3. I mean, and it, they are. It's not just what they're saying about voting. It's about what they believe. And if you're a campaign, somebody who runs campaigns, if you're trying to make this a choice on immigration, one party's pro-immigration, one party's anti-immigration. The country's gone from 50% pro-immigration to 2/3. Well, you're running up against a huge barrier against your election on how you're defining the election. What you're pointing to is your accomplishment. What you're pointing to as your accomplishment is what people view is why they're voting against you. And so in area after area, he's just become out of sync with a changing country. There are demographic trends as well, but it's more a trend in consciousness in terms of what people are thinking and how that's affecting what the election's about.
Stan, very short question and short answer, hopefully.
Okay.
Who do you think is going to win in November, and by how much?
Well, I think Joe Biden, obviously going to be the nominee. I think the party will unite. I don't know who the vice president selection will be. The Sanders voters were a huge part of what helped him from winning. 15% of Sanders voted for another candidate. That's probably the most important piece. But I can see Biden winning by 7 or 8 points nationally. That would put him way beyond Obama's 2008 win. And that would put him into having a strong electoral college win as well.
All right. We're going to leave it there, gentlemen. Much more to discuss as we move closer to November. I want to thank our guest, Stan Greenberg, Democratic pollster and author of RIP GOP, for joining us. Rick, good to see you and your bow tie. Be sure to check us out and follow me at Alexis TV News.
Oh, I'm supposed to say something. I forgot.
Jump in here, Rick.
And me at Rick J. Newman. I blame the technology format.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for checking in. Stay safe, be well, and we'll see you next time.